Okay, well, good morning, everybody. On behalf of GCAP and SDG Watch Europe, I'd like to welcome you to the 2022 European People's Assembly. There'll be time for questions at the end, so please feel free to post your comments and questions in the chat. And for everyone who's speaking, I'll sound a bell with a 1-minute time warning, like that, to give you some time. My name's Sarah Franklin, and I'll be the facilitator and moderator for this European Assembly. I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of food systems in the context of our current global situation and what's happening in the EU as well. As we know, the pandemic and Brexit and the war on Ukraine have highlighted the need for swift and comprehensive alignment of the SDGs and Agenda 2030 with the recovery and resilience plans for building back better. And in this global decade of action, the UN General Assemblies and SDGs Week are auspicious occasions to focus on our common future and design the kind of world that we want our children to inherit. However, evidence from the latest reports on SDGs progress in the EU and globally show a continuing downward trajectory in environmental and social inequalities. And these are brought about by incoherent policies that continue to ignore the consequences of unsustainable economic growth strategies. Therefore, it's time for policy and financial frameworks to be aligned. In terms of the SDGs, the SDSN survey of government efforts for the SDGs finds that only 9 EU member states have a high commitment and 6 countries only have a low commitment to the SDGs. Even among the top-rated countries in Europe, the assessment made by the Climate Action Tracker shows that the strategies and actions of those governments are insufficient to achieve the objectives set out in the Paris Climate Agreement. Key findings from the 2021 SDSN European Sustainable Development Report highlight that Europe's greatest challenges are in the areas of agriculture, climate, biodiversity, and sustainable diet. The report also finds that although Europe is the global leader for the SDGs, it has yet to account for international spillovers and the impacts of its global policies. In its 2020 work programme, the Commission committed to aligning all of its work programmes with the 2030 agenda. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing from our keynote speaker on this. So where do we stand with global hunger? 5 years into a global commitment to eliminate hunger by 2030, progress has stalled and we're rapidly losing ground. In 2019, an estimated 690 million people were hungry, and upwards of 2 billion suffer from chronic persistent hunger. And this was before COVID-19 added 130 million people to the world's hungry, pushing millions more to the brink of hunger and putting a third of food and farming livelihoods at risk. So how is the EU responding to all this? In 2021, the EU's Standing Committee on Agricultural Research called for urgent food systems reform to drive COVID-19 recovery and system-based approaches that include coherent policies for governing food systems overall. Other advocates for sustainable food system reform include the cross-party MEP Sustainable Food Systems Group, the EESC, the European Committee of the Regions, who adopted an opinion statement towards a sustainable EU food policy, and the Commission's Joint Research Centre, who developed a sustainability food compass. The 2019 IPES food report towards a common food policy for the European Union maps out a new governance architecture for food systems aligned with the 2030 agenda and a clear vision of the policy reform required to deliver fair, equal, sustainable food systems. Agroecological principles are applied to optimize interactions between humans, plants, animals, and environment. Yet this piece of work has yet to be fully appreciated and integrated into policymaking, which is why I'm delighted to say that we'll be hearing from Émile Frison from IPES Food later in the morning. Despite the initial ambition and intention of mainstreaming the SDGs across EU policymaking, the European Green Deal, which is the Commission's flagship for sustainable development in the EU, NGOs and civil society networks are calling upon the Commission to include the social and gender dimensions of the 2030 Agenda and the Common Agricultural Policy. So our session today will highlight examples of what a food system looks like in practice if it's sustainable. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first distinguished speaker, Mr. Jorge Pinto Antunes, who's the Deputy Head of the Cabinet for the European Commission for Agriculture and Rural Development. He's very kindly agreed to share what his cabinet is working on and his hopes for the future in establishing a sustainable food system for Europe. Mr. Antunes, thank you for being with us here today. The floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you also for this invitation. I'm delighted to be here today to tell us, well, discuss and share with you a little bit of what we're doing in terms of our work towards a more sustainable food system for Europe. And I have to start, of course, with the European Green Deal, which is our flagship initiative, but it's also a slim 24-page document, but it has an enormous scope and indeed very high ambitions. It basically set out our main objectives for the EU in terms of achieving net zero emissions by 2050, which of course is in line with our global efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees above pre-industrial averages. This Green Deal, European Green Deal, is not a piece of legislation, but it's rather a set of agreed objectives. And achieving those objectives will also actually require new rules. And this is what we've been working on from the start of this mandate of this College of Commissioners, which is the executive arm of the EU. The European Green Deal obviously starts by acknowledging also that while the EU food system has achieved a high level of food security, food safety, and also wide consumer choice, it also risks not being able to address broader societal expectations, specifically on sustainability. We know that agriculture in the EU is responsible for around 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And we also know that agriculture as a sector is also the locus of stress on biodiversity, on soils, on water, and on air. And this is why the European Green Deal sets also EU goals in terms of a transition and a transformation in our food system. Namely, with the Green Deal on agriculture, we want to ensure food security in the face of climate change and biodiversity loss. We also want to reduce the environmental and climate footprint of the EU food system. We want to strengthen the EU food system's resilience, but overall, we want to lead a global transition towards more competitive sustainability from farm to fork. Farm to fork, which is also one of the main pillars of the European Green Deal. It's our flagship initiative, so to say, more focused on the food system. It's an important step, we believe, towards a fairer, a healthier, but also a more environmental friendly food system. This strategy aims to accelerate our transition to a sustainable food system, and it basically gives us a roadmap to advance in that direction. And that direction should basically lead us to a place where we have neutral or positive environmental impacts, where we help to mitigate climate change and adapt to its impacts, where we reverse the loss of biodiversity, where we also actually ensure food security, better nutrition, public health, and also make sure that everyone has access to sufficient, safe, nutritious, and sustainable foods. And equally important, we also want to preserve affordability of food while generating, of course, fairer economic returns and fostering competitiveness of the EU supply sector and promoting fair trade. To enable this transition, the Farm to Fork sets out our intentions in terms of an overall of our legal framework. There are a number of initiatives which we've been working on, legislative initiatives. but it also launches other companion initiatives because it's a comprehensive strategy. It's not just about legal overhaul. It's also about advisory services to farmers. It's also about new financial instruments. It's also about research and innovation, which are instrumental as they can help resolve tensions, develop and test solutions, but also overcome some of the barriers and uncover new market opportunities. We've been working on this for the past 2.5 years. I'm happy to report that we've had a couple of successes in terms of putting forward such frameworks and legislative pieces out there. I would, for instance, highlight the Organic Farming Action Plan. I would highlight the sustainable use of pesticides. I would highlight the Industrial Emissions Directive, a number of different initiatives that will, when they are approved by the co-legislators, meaning the EU member states, but also the European Parliament, make a change in how we go about in terms of our agricultural, but also more broadly in terms of our food system. Let me focus on organics, because under the European Green Deal and also the Farm to Fork strategy, the European Commission has set at a target of at least 25% of the EU's agricultural land under organic farming and a significant increase in organic agriculture by 2030. Why organics? Because organics fully embraces all the three aspects of sustainability. It is, of course, more environmental sustainable due to the low impact in terms of farm management systems. It also socially sustainable, as it's an opportunity if fully grabbed by women farmers, by the young farmers, to keep rural areas alive. And it's also about more broadly economic sustainability, as it grants a decent income to farmers thanks to the premium price that must be preserved. To achieve this goal of 25% and to help organics reach its full potential, we have put out last year an action plan for organic production in the EU. It is broken down in 3 interlinked axes, this action plan, which basically reflects the food supply chain and also our Green Deal sustainability objectives. Axis 1 aims to stimulate demand and ensure consumer trust. Axis 2 of this action plan aims to stimulate conversion and reinforce the entire value chain. And Axis 3, it's also about making organics lead by example, improve the contribution of organic farming to environmental sustainability even more. And these 3 axes of broad actions are actually supported by 23 different actions, which, if implemented successfully, we believe will mobilize different sources of funding, but will also increase organic production and will also basically play an essential role in terms of developing a sustainable food system for the EU. It's a broader objective that we have. So we are working on agriculture production, we are working on food systems, but we also need to ensure that agriculture production takes place in more sustainable ways in the EU, broadly speaking. We need to ensure that we also reap the maximum positive externalities from agriculture. We know that agriculture plays in rural areas an important role in terms of landscape management, in terms of rural vitality, in terms of Europe's rural areas, which can provide us with food, but also homes, jobs, and essential ecosystem services. To ensure that rural areas and agriculture, broadly speaking, can continue to play these essential roles, we have also launched last year a long-term vision for the EU rural areas up to 2040. It basically identifies areas of action towards a stronger, towards connected, towards resilient, and also prosperous rural areas and communities. When we shape this long-term vision, we gather the views of rural communities, but also businesses via very comprehensive public consultations, but also stakeholder-led events. Through this collaborative process, we have created a wide-ranging vision, but also a comprehensive rural action plan that should help rural communities and businesses reach their full potential in the coming decades. Our aim, of course, is more resilient rural areas that foster well-being. and the preservation of natural resources, the restoration of landscapes, agricultural funds, of course, but also the greening of farming activities and shortening supply chains that can make rural areas more resilient to climate change, natural hazards, but also economic crisis. As providers of services that protect ecosystems and also solutions for carbon neutrality, rural areas have and can play a key role in terms of our sustainability and transition towards a circular economy. Let me zoom in also on a particular instrument that will have an important role to play in this agenda, the Common Agriculture Policy. The Common Agriculture Policy offers member states of the EU different tools that are and can be even more pertinent to help farmers to implement our broad European Green Deal deals, but also the Farm to Fork strategy. We have reformed this policy as proposed by the Commission, and we are now introducing a more flexible performance, but also results-based approach that takes into account the local condition and needs, but also increases EU-level ambitions in terms of sustainability. We have 9 common objectives that cover economic, social, but also environmental dimensions. And in line with the European Green Deal ambitions, they actually aim to increase the contribution of EU agriculture to climate change action, improve the management of natural resources, ensure a fair economic return for farmers, but also reinforce the protection of biodiversity, among other objectives. It's a new way of working that has been proposed as part of the Common Agriculture Policy. And it's a new way of working that will be compatible with the European Green Deal. We are based our new proposals and what we'll be doing in terms of agricultural support on assessment of the local conditions and needs. Member states will have to produce a so-called national Common Agriculture Policy strategic plan that will explain how they will use the CAP tools to achieve those objectives. And needless to say, those plans should be coherent and should be consistent with the required environmental ambition. We are now in the process of approving each CAP strategic plan. I'm happy to report that to a large extent, environmental and broader sustainability considerations are incorporated to a higher degree in these plans. And how are member states doing this? The future CAP includes conditionalities, which links area and animal-based CAP payments to a range of obligations. It also introduces new so-called eco schemes that aim to reward farmers for going further in the implementation of sustainable agricultural practices. These practices could actually include the implementation of environmental friendly production systems such as agroecology, agroforestry, but also organic farming. Moreover, we have also under the Rural Development Plan, which is an important part of the CAP, made available funds that can be used in terms of green infrastructure investments, in knowledge transfer, in innovation, you name it. And I would like to underline that as part of the CAP proposals, member states need to include a minimum of 30% of rural development plans towards interventions that address specific environmental and climate-related objectives. This is a broad agenda that we have. We have basically just started. In parallel, of course, we've had the COVID crisis. We've also witnessing the recent crisis in Ukraine, which basically demonstrates that the vulnerabilities of our food systems in terms of supply chain, but also in terms of import dependence, such as fertilizers, are challenges that we need to address. But with my intervention here today, I actually would like to emphasize that these two crises that we have witnessed and we are still basically living when I speak about the crisis in Ukraine, also underscore that sustainability is our only way path towards food security. These two crises have made it clear that the framework that we proposed as part of the European Green Deal, but also specifically the Farm to Fork strategy, is very much relevant. Take, for instance, the example of organics. During the COVID pandemics, which already seems far away, organics was one of the sectors that showed the highest resilience in terms of the food system. The current context in terms of international geopolitical tension, but also the extreme weather conditions, has also made it clear that increasing organic production can help us become less dependent on fossil fuel-based agricultural inputs, for instance, and thus can contribute investment in this sort of initiatives can actually contribute towards more resilience of our agricultural sector. I think this is very, very clear for our political and decision-maker masters in the EU. This being a conversation that is happening not just in the EU, of course. I think it's also fair to point out that global challenges will require comprehensive solutions. We need all actors along the food chain to move together towards these sustainable food systems. In the EU, this work has just begun. In 2023, for instance, we will come forward with a proposal for a framework law on sustainable food systems, which to some extent will be the cherry on the top of all the work that we'll be doing. But it's something where we in the EU want to have a leadership, where we want to share experiences, and where we also want to make it right, because the challenges that we need to face are rather big. So we need ambitious and bold policies, and this is what we are planning to do in the next couple of years. I'll leave it at that, and happy afterwards to engage in the conversations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It's really good to hear all of the things that are happening in the Commission around sustainable food systems, Jorge, and very much appreciate you taking the time to be here. So thank you for that. Right, we were going to show a video, but in respect of time, we're going to put that on later and move straight on with the presentations. Next, we're going to have a presentation from Murad Al-Kofash, whose presentation is about permaculture in Palestine, planting seeds of hope in the occupied territories. Murad is the founder and director of Marda Permaculture Farm in the West Bank of the occupied territories in Palestine. I first met Murad in Jordan in 2011, where he gave a presentation about his farm in a remote camp in the middle of the desert in the Wadi Rum. Over the years, his stories of survival are some of the most heartbreaking, but also inspiring I have ever heard. And I've watched Murad's farm grow against all the odds from a bare, stony, earth-scorched piece of land into a thriving food forest and flourishing oasis of fruit trees. Marda is an international permaculture education training center now. Murad, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. Welcome to the European People's Assembly. You have the floor. Let's see if we can get Murad in from Palestine here. Bear with us, please. I don't think he's in the room yet, so perhaps what we'll do, the best thing is we'll move on and wait for Murad to come in and see where we go from there. So next, I would like to introduce Dr. Katalin Nagy of the who's going to do a presentation for us on Roma community gardens. Dr. Katalin is a sociologist and an EU policy expert, and from 2002 to 2011, she was a member of the Employment Committee and the Social Question Working Party of the European Council in Brussels. And in 2011, at the time of the Hungarian presidency, she was responsible for launching the employment and social dimension of the Europe 2020 strategy and the EU Roma framework strategy. So Dr. Nagy, very welcome to the Global People's Assembly, this European Assembly. You have the floor. Could you unmute yourself?
Okay.
Thank you.
Fine. So, dear participants, dear colleagues, in my presentation, I will give a brief insight into a Hungarian community gardening project designed for vulnerable population. As an external consultant for the Butterfly Development Association, which developed and implemented this program, I was involved in this as well. This is how I became a speaker today. Many thanks for the opportunity. And first, briefly about the Ergo network I represent now here. Slide, please. The Ergo network is an umbrella organization of 31 national members representing grassroots Roma communities across Europe, and it was founded in 2008. Its objective is to combat poverty, inequality, anti-Gypsyism, and to strengthen Roma civil society and participation in decision-making at local, national, and European levels. The Ergo renewing structure enables various options for involvement, such as Friend of Ergo, featured on the front page of my presentation, which can be voted for long-time contributors. And I am proud and happy to receive that title. Next, please. And now let's to the program, the subject of this presentation. The program is called Pro Ratatouille and was developed in 2009 by the Butterfly Complex Regional Development Association, a Hungarian non-profit organization, former member of the Ergo. The program won the social business idea contest of the Nobel laureate economist Mohamed Yunus in 2010. The social platform umbrella organization selected among the best European integration program in 2017, and it was implemented in more than 20 settlements in Hungary. And now to about the program. The program is, next is a community-based, complex, organic, that is chemical-free gardening program, creating employment, offering non-formal education, and facilitating Roma integration. Next, please. The strength of the program is that it offers complex answers to complex social problems. We experienced that unemployed residents of peripheral communities in Hungary not only suffer from poverty, but are completely powerless in a situation in which they miss not the will, but the possibilities to work, and also occupation, which doesn't provide, which does provide not only livelihood, but respect and satisfaction as well. Understanding the complexity of the local poverty, the Butterfly intended to spread the program step by step in the hope that local knowledge will accumulate and the locals will start their own project later on. So among others, the program aims to disseminate sustainable development models in disadvantaged small village communities in Hungary. The implemented program decreased unemployment, fights malnutrition, contributes to food security, introduce a healthy and sustainable lifestyle, healthier and more sustainable, I would add, reduces the burden on the environment, and contributes to fighting prejudice toward the Roma minority by enabling Roma and non-Roma members of the community to work together towards a common goal. An important indirect effect of the program is that the idea and the practice of chemical-free gardening becomes known at the settlement level. Next, please. The main dimension of the programs are its design, which is tailored to the local feature in each particular cases, the implementation itself, the community gardening projects working together with the help of community empowerment, participation-based development, and non-formal adult education. So again, the main elements of the program is the participatory planning. Next, please. For the whole period, from the point of what to put into what to grow in the garden, and then what to do with the crop. Community education and gardening session. It's indeed intensive common learning on the basis of particularly developed curricula. Workshops to learn gardening, how to use the products, and in a later stage, it ended to a session how to run a sustainable household, working together in garden and in processing vegetables, and small feast for the villagers organized by the beneficiaries to celebrate their work and share their experiences. These were, of course, the most lucrative part of one of the most lucrative parts of the program. The main structure of the activities next is built on non-formal education and empowerment in order to serve the following goals: learning the basics of organic gardening and community-based development, learning of informal skills required for formal, regular work as well, creating a spirit of teamwork and cooperation, creating a sense of responsibility, setting the basis for initiative and making life plans, development of self-confidence, creating the ability of knowledge, positive life changes in this environment. And now about the participants. The participants, next please, of the program are disadvantaged individuals, regardless of ethnic identity, employment status, age, and gender. Anyone could join the program who wishes to learn the skills needed for organic vegetable production and who wants to support their families with healthy vegetables. Roma and non-Roma, unemployed and employed, retired people, mothers with small children, and young people are all represented in the program. And finally, about the dirty financial details, how it is financed. Or the main financial resources are provided by Hungarian authorities, ministries, local authorities, and a big contributor was the Esther Foundation, and CSR-driven multinationals and embassies were also a big help. EU programs, of course, Norwegian grants, and various international grants and programs. And all in all, based on the experience of the program, it can be stated, it's okay, it can be stated that Roma people are ready and able to learn and work, ready to participate in activities resulting in a sustainable food system, with particular regard to effective poverty reduction, empowerment, climate protection, and healthier lifestyle, just to name a few results. However, all these require long-term investment and complex support. The funding is indeed a big point. To achieve sustainability needs longer time than the usual span of usual projects, and it won't work without it. Unfortunately, this happened with this pro-rata program as well, whose supported distribution had to be suspended due to the lack of necessary resources. Hopefully, future followers, program initiators, and especially with the help of the just earlier heard EU background, hopefully will be more fortunate and resource rich, and will have a longer period of functioning of this program. That was the story of this Hungarian case. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Dr. Nagy. That was really interesting to hear about the action that Roma are taking in the communities. It's fantastic. I would very much like to turn now to Mr. Steve Charter, who's going to talk to us about permaculture and some projects that he's working on. And Steve has worked in the sustainability field since 1993 on numerous innovative and pioneering sustainability projects, particularly in the fields of sustainable construction and sustainability education. He's an experienced permaculture tutor and actively involved in the development of permaculture education in Britain and in Europe. He currently has the fundraising role with the Permaculture Association of Britain, as well as being a founding director of Evolution Music Limited, which is a company inspired by permaculture ethics and creators of the world's first bioplastic LPs. So bioplastic vinyl, everyone. Steve is the joint coordinator of IPEN, which is the International Permaculture Education Network, and he's here to tell us about some of the projects that he's been working on. Steve, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. The floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Hopefully some of you will know of permaculture as a global movement that's been very much involved in the development of organic and regenerative food growing systems and of sustainable lifestyle design. So I'm going to talk briefly about one of the projects that we're involved in across Europe, which is funded by Erasmus. If we could have the next slide, please. So it's a project with 7 partners across Europe. We just squeezed in before our government took us out of the European funding systems. So this project has come about through collaboration amongst the European permaculture organizations. And so, yeah, we're very pleased to have been able to get this funded. So the project is called IACT. It's about supporting the development of new and existing learning and demonstration projects in the field of permaculture and regenerative land management, regenerative community development, regenerative design and practice. So next slide, please. And we used the name activating community transformation because we see these centers as being catalysts for transformation. And it was interesting to hear Jorge Pinto Atunes talking about the need for leading by example. This is exactly the point of this project, is to create demonstration projects in regenerative food systems, regenerative farming and land management that others can visit and see what the practice looks like. They can participate in education, in courses, visitors and volunteers can get a feel for the practices and how to work as organizations in these areas. So the UK started an initiative called Land Centres. So these are permaculture learning and demonstration projects where LAND stands for learning, activities or action, networking and demonstration. So these are centres where all these activities take place. And then we've added to that the idea of IACT centres for activating community transformation as catalyst centres for local to regional resilience and regeneration. So the land centres are primarily focused on land management, design of sustainable food systems and regenerative food systems, but not exclusive. They can also have examples of green building and renewable energy systems. And the IACT centres are more holistic. So the characteristics of these centres will be that they have published education programs, opportunities for visits and volunteering, and one of the inspirations for this is beyond the permaculture movement is the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales, which over many years has had a really important place, has many participants in their master's programs from across Europe. So these aren't only in-person courses, they can be blended courses with online and in-person elements, or remote learning opportunities. So we've seen the value of learning and demonstration projects in this area over many years. So next slide, please. So the Land Network started, as I say, in Britain and was a funded project through our national lottery system for a number of years from about 2011 to 2015, and then ran out of funding. And we didn't secure additional funding because we were deemed too successful, or so successful that we didn't need any further support. We massively exceeded the targets for outcomes in terms of number of trainees and visitors. So through this IACT project, which started in 2020 and runs through to 2023, we've reinvigorated the UK Land Initiative, and other countries, particularly Denmark, took up the model about probably 5 to 7 years ago and have been very successful creating a land network in Denmark. And that's also led to, they work with most of the Scandinavian countries, have similar projects. Bulgaria is developing its network, and lots of countries are seeing this great value of learning and demonstration projects. So we're creating a model where we can spread this system. Next slide, please. And this is from small scale gardens to community gardens to farm scale regenerative agriculture. So we cover all those scales, and hopefully when Morad does the presentation on permaculture in Palestine, you'll be able to get more of a sense of an example there of what it means in practice. So what we're creating is a support system to help spread these centres with a toolkit and good practice guide, a handbook. We'll have introductory training courses on how to establish a learning and demonstration centre, or how to develop it further and develop visions for the next phase of evolution if it's an established centre. So we'll, as I say, we'll create this support system. It's primarily going to be hosted by the UK Permaculture Association, but it'll be shared across the network with some levels of translation for some of the outputs. And as a funded project, these outputs will be freely available. We haven't quite got the website up, but that will be coming, going live later this autumn, with a enhanced version available early next year. Next slide, please. So what we've done is we've taken a set of criteria which about design of projects, about education programs, about how to engage with visitors and volunteers and the local community, how projects are managed. That's the essence of the land centre system, that projects fulfill these criteria, provide evidence of that relatively simple process, but so they've got some guidance on what good practice means. And then we've added a holistic framework for the IAT centres so that we're covering a broader range of fields such as building, tools and technology, which for example would be renewable energy systems, education, also getting into regenerative economics and social enterprise structures and so on and so forth. So we have this holistic model that can cover eco-villages. Clough Jordan Eco-Village in Ireland is a good example of one of the member projects in the partnership. Transition hubs, we have the National Transition Centre for Luxembourg, CEL is a partner as well. So we're covering this broad range of eco-villages, transition hubs, permaculture projects, regenerative farms, which have all been a strong influence, strongly influenced by the permaculture movement, which started in the 1970s. Next slide, please. And has spread to become a global movement. So just some simple examples, creating volunteer policies, business plans, all these sorts of things we would see a lot of what we call reinventing the wheel, projects doing something that's already been done by many others. So if we can just simply provide templates and good examples, it speeds up the process and helps spread good practice and emerging practice. Some of the tools are very practical, some are more strategic, some will relate to design, and there'll be case studies of good examples to help inspire change. Next slide, please. We've also gone down the route of looking at the skills, knowledge, and attitudes and experience, the competencies that are needed to set up and run these types of centres. And typically these are set up by people who have a lot of passion and experience around sustainability issues, for example. But what we're finding, of course, not surprisingly, is there's a great deal of very transferable skills around management, organisation, administration, marketing, community engagement. These are all really, really important skills which determine how well the centre will function. So creating the competency map and learning pathways for these different fields, when we focus that down on 5 fields, the carbon reduction, regeneration and sustainability skills. So obviously, for example, regenerative horticulture, regenerative farming skills, those sorts of areas, as well as green building or renewable energy. Project competencies, so how to design and implement a project and how you monitor the outcomes of that. Learning and demonstration competencies, communication, facilitation and engagement competencies, and then the organizational and management competencies, which will, for example, include appropriate decision-making systems or organization structures. Next slide, please. So that leads us to the learning pathways that are needed to develop those competencies. So this is where we'll be developing learning programs for each of these areas, which typically will have an entry-level training, then core trainings in the relevant areas, and then extended learning pathways, which are moving more into practice development, observation, and understanding our experiences of learning and practice, not so much focus on taught courses as people pursue their extended learning pathways. Next slide, please. And then we'll also have a mapping and research system so that we're mapping where these centres exist already and where they're emerging, showing whether they're early stage projects or later stage mature projects. And those will include a summary profile, and some will have case studies available. If you click on the pin for the project, you'll be able to see a case study for those projects. So it's also a way for them to have a public face and gain more attention for the good work they're doing. Next slide, please. And then the land learner journey, as we're calling it, will be a simple structured approach that helps people through the process of fulfilling the criteria that's needed to become a land centre or an IAT centre. So that's something that's currently in development and will be available from the early part of next year, piloting it in the UK, starting this autumn. Next slide, please. And for us, certainly in the UK Association, whilst we've gone through the, for many of us, somewhat frustrating Brexit process, we're very, very keen to maintain this ongoing collaboration with European Union countries. So a lot of this is also about exploring and sharing good economic models, whether these projects are in private ownership, charitable projects, or run as cooperatives, for example, social enterprise formats, the different understanding of projects that work very well depending on the local context, depending on the skills and the organizations involved. Next slide, please. But that's emphasizing that this is about livelihoods for people that are running these projects, often with multiple incomes from growing produce, but also running education and training, and often involved in the green tourism sector as well, with either camping or glamping or cabins and huts or different types of accommodation. So multi-stranded income streams. And just to complete, this is very much part of an example of the sort of activity within the European Permaculture Network, and the EUPC.community is the platform that we're steadily developing for networking amongst national organizations and networks, and for building the community. So this IACT project, there's another project we're involved in with 8 partners called Community Climate Coaches, and through EUPC.community we'll be running regular national yearly main conferences, but series of different types of events to support the growth and development of the movement. So from March the 1st to the 5th will be the next European Permaculture Community Forum, which is key for developing our movement, and the many really important partnerships with the regenerative farming and food movement. That's it from me.
Great, Steve. Thanks a million for that. Hearing about permaculture and your other projects, I think it's really interesting when we all meet together and we get to hear about the amazing work that everyone is doing. This is the value of these events for me, is that we actually can see what people are doing and be inspired by it. So thank you very much for that. I think we're going to go right now on to Murad Al-Khafash, who was in the room, but we couldn't quite see him. So Murad, you're very, very welcome. We're looking forward to hearing your news from Palestine. And Murad makes great olive oil, by the way, everyone, and sells it in Europe. So you're very welcome, Murad. You have the floor.
Can you hear me?
Perfectly well.
Oh, that's nice. Because a while ago, I didn't use this Zoom issue since maybe 2-3 years. So I'm so happy to be with you guys. And first of all, we say Assalamu alaikum, like peace be upon you. And I'm so happy to be with you and to share about my knowledge, about my experience, about our life in Palestine. And I'm sure everybody what is Palestine and what's happening in Palestine. So yeah, as Sarah said, my name is Murad, and I'm the director of Marda Permaculture Farm. I've been involved in permaculture since 1993. And then in 2006, I established my own farm, what's called Marda Permaculture Farm. I start from zero, and if you go to the slides, we can show the land. If another one is like it was empty land, it's full of stones. If you go next, this slide showing as you see the red line around, it's the settlement. One of the biggest settlement in West Bank is called for the Israeli. It's called Ariel, and Marda, it's in next to it, the north side. As you see, is a small town. And if you look, we have surrounded by the fence, that's the red line, and the street 505. But from north side, from the east, if you look on the right side, there's the Fuh. It's another settlement. So we are in a small jail. They have two. We have two gates, from one from east and one from west. When the soldiers close the gates, nobody can get in, nobody can get out. So imagine this kind of life that we're facing every day, every single minute, even with Israeli. So if you go next slide, please. So here's talk about the history of the farm that I mentioned a little bit about that, and how we I started this in 2006, and in Summertown there's the Global Vision Institute. They gave me the umbrella to start this project under their name, and where we start doing the courses and teaching about permaculture in my town. Can you go next, please? And this land, that's the day I start work in this land, was look like that. I have a few trees there. If you look on the right side, there's a small olive tree, and the most of the land's full of stones. It was empty. If you stand in one side, you can see the other side easy without anything in your face facing you. And so I start doing the fence around the farm first, because we have lots of wild pigs, and they used to come into the place and damage everything I put there. So first I did the fence and start moving all the stones from the farm. Can you go next? And here, as you see, I start building the fence, and I used so that's something we have it everywhere. They dump it in the valley or next to the road, the tires, the used tires. As I told you first, I have lots of stones, so I use the tires to fill the tires with stones. And in this case, I have a wall built and no more stones in the garden. And that will protect my garden from the animals and the wild pigs too. Next. And here you see, we have the wall almost done and full with stones. Next, please. You know, the challenge, you know, it's like everywhere. We are under occupation. Sometimes army get into the place, damage something there, cut the fence. Once they cut the fence just to get in with no reason, the wild pigs. And one of the other thing is the funding. You know, to build a place like that from zero, for sure you need some money, and to get money was not, you know, not easy. But I succeed to get some funding from different places in the world, like Australia, America, UK, like Lush. They support me for a few years, and right now I'm a supplier for Lush. I sell oil for them that I buy from the farmers. And you know, always funding is a problem. Sometimes you have a plan to do something, but this plan keeps stopped because you have no money to do the plan. I have a plan to build accommodation house for volunteers at the farm. Until now, I did not, because there's no money. So, you know, sometimes money is the main issue to do the things. Next, please. Next. No need to talk about goals. You know, permaculture, people don't know. And this is the farm, how it looked like a few years ago. When everything started to become green, I built the bath. I do the design for the garden. I start putting trees there, like fruit trees, all kinds of fruit trees. Anytime I have a new tree, I just put there. Sorry. And plus vegetables. So I grow most of kinds of vegetables in the greenhouse. I have a small greenhouse there, or outside, like under the trees or between the trees. So anything you imagine, I can put it there. At the beginning, I have a problem with water, but now I have no problem with water because I connect the farm with the spring. We have a spring in the village, about 400 meters away. So I run a hose from the spring down to the farm. Now I have no problem with water at all. I have lots of water, even more than what I need. Go next, please. Crops, as I said, like we have olives, citrus, almonds, lemon, oranges, all kind of fruit trees, plus legume trees, jacaranda, acacia, carob, albizia. You know, these to just to support the slow growing trees. And now I start cutting down those trees, like especially the albizia, is because this one drive me crazy. They grow everywhere now. And I have trees, they just grow and they really give good shade for the place, and they become good productive trees now. Next. There's a cistern holding water. I used to use the greenhouse to fill from rainwater to fill it, but now because I have the spring, so I run the hose into the cistern, and this cistern is full with water since 3 years, because I don't need to use it now, because I have the hose is keep running from the spring. Next. These tires is the garden, tire garden, the soil I had from digging the cistern, it was here. So I surround this pile of soil with these tires to use as a garden. You know, tires, they can work as a microclimate. So they get heat in the daytime, in the night, because they hot, when you have cool breeze come in, then they catch the dew. So they can irrigate the plants automatically from the dew, and I don't need to go to water them by using something to hose or something. So they can get water from the dew. In winter, they do the same thing. When you have some sun show up, they get heat. So if you have frost in the night, the frost will not hit a hot surface like the tires. In that case, whatever you have inside the tires, they'll be protected from frost. So there's no chance to be damaged. And you know, tires, we have them everywhere, as I said, and it's a good shape, like a pyramids or like stairs. I have them, and you can grow different types of vegetables there. Yes. This is the picture of the greenhouse. I designed the greenhouse to have different rooms. I have 8 rooms there, or 8 raised beds, where I grow all kinds of vegetables. Each bed has at least 5-6 kinds of vegetables. Some of them is climbing, is a bush, or some of the bush, or running, or like onions, garlic, cabbages, cauliflowers, mints, cucumbers, tomato. So, you know, so everything starts growing. But now, these days, I don't have the plastic or the mesh around. I lost the plastic because of the wind and in winter, and I cannot afford to buy a new plastic. So I changed my mind, I changed the system, and I'm going to run grapes around the greenhouse and to have vines. So next year, the next picture will be like you have the whole 250 meters of the greenhouse is full of grapes. Next. That's a bathtub. It was used, and I have it now as for worms. So I use worms to make compost and to show the students and farmers when they come how we can make compost by using the worms. Yes. Next, please. This is the compost area where I collect everything from the farm, the leaves, the leftover from vegetables, manure from the chickens or the pigeons that I have. Sometimes I buy more manure, and here I make compost to cover the garden and to keep the soil fertilized and in a healthy soil, to have healthy soil. And you know, in the end, the crops get healthy because I have my own compost. Next, please. Beehives, as you should have, any farm have to have beehives. You know, bees, they can give income as to have honey, and they are good for pollination. And without bees, there's no life in the planet. Next, please. This picture of when we have students, we were showing them how to deal with the beehives, how to see, to check on them if they have disease, if they have something, you need to feed them sometimes in winter. Next. This is the chicken coop. I built it from natural material, like I used earth bags and mud and clay and straw, and I covered them with this dates palm leaves to give shade for them. Next. And this is the sitting area. This area was just a garden a few years before I started to become a sitting area. But the wild pigs get in and they damage that garden. They spend all the night there. So when I come, I find they damage everything. They ate everything I have there. And it was hard for me to dig again. So I decided to change the system and to do it a social area or sitting area where we gather. And later on, I built a vine around so people can sit in a shade and they'll be in the middle of the garden and everything around you is full of green and trees. Or so when you sit and you look, you see a good view in front of you. Yes, next, please. There's an oven we did with the students where we can make pizza or food in an oven. We did it from clay, and it was a sample to show people like you can cook on fire, no need to use gas. Yes. This picture, like when during the courses we did with the students, we target international students and Palestinian students. So it was open for everybody to attend the courses. We did 7 courses since 2006, and we give certificate as a permaculture design course. And here show the student when they do their workshop or their presentation at the end of the course. Next, please. So as I said, we did the design course and we give certificates. We did the design for the place. We work with the community by running. We did for them like irrigation, gray water system garden, and we did having students from the farm itself and from the Palestine. And I run a project in Jericho for the YMCA. They have a land. I designed the place, and we have a very productive garden now there. Next, please. I cannot see because there's something showing in the screen. That's I think that's the place how it looked like at the YMCA. Before we start, that's how it looked like, and this is the other side there. And now when I start do the Mandela Garden, that's how it look like now. We did adobe by using earth bags and mud and clay. So they use this room now as a small store to sell things for the students. So we grow the garden with the students, and in the greenhouse we have greenhouse there. We have an aquaponic system, and we have a garden. So it's become a full productive garden there. Next. I don't know if I have enough time, but I need to mention about the olive oil that Marda, it's in Salfit district, and Salfit district is known as the olive trees governorate. We have lots of olive oil, and I got succeed to sell oil to Lush in UK. So, and we're looking forward to have more customers buying our olive oil from Marda. And because we have lots, as I said, we have lots of oil, and that's one of the good support or great support we can have to support the farmers by selling their oil. Because here the price is not really cheap, and people do use the farmers' need and get the oil very cheap price. So that's one of the things I work on it to sell more oil for the farmers outside Palestine.
Great,
and,
Murad.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I don't know if we have more time, if somebody have questions or there's no chance for questions, I don't know.
Murad, we are running out of time, but we have time for questions at the end, okay? So I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions then. Thank you for that amazing presentation. I look forward to some wine from your grapes, and I'm very
No
interested.
wine, no wine,
No wine. Grape juice. I'm very interested to see how, you know, bringing together a farming community and, you know, the policymakers and the people that are working on the research, and how we can work together to bring products such as yours from Palestine into Europe, and how we go about that. So I would like to introduce our next speaker, Emile Frison, who he sits on the IPES food panel and is an expert on conservation and agricultural biodiversity. He was head of global research for development for 10 years of Biodiversity International, and in 2003 he was the Director General. He's currently the chair of the International Scientific Committee on Sustainable Food Systems of the Daniel and Nina Carasso Foundation. And he has a particular interest in sustainable food systems and the deployment of agricultural biodiversity to improve nutrition and the resilience and sustainability of agricultural systems. Emile, you're very, very welcome. You have the floor. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to join you here today. I thought of giving you an overview of some of the work that IPES Food has been doing over the last few years that is of interest to your meeting here today. And maybe I'll start with the first substantive report produced by IPES Food in 2016, which was called From Uniformity to Diversity, which is about a paradigm shift away from industrial agriculture towards diversified agroecological systems. And I think that drew a lot of attention to the need for a real food system transformation. We also, that was followed by a report on the impact of our current food systems on health. And I think this is a particular area that is vastly underestimated, the negative impact of our current food systems on health. But maybe more relevant particularly to Europe, is that in 2017, we started a process going towards a European food policy. We know we have the common agricultural policy, which is in contradiction with what we are trying to do in terms of health. It's in contradiction with the aspirations of the Environment Directorate of the Commission itself. And the idea was to really build some concrete suggestions on what a European food policy could look like and how we would get there. So for a period of 3 years, we held policy labs in which we invited people from civil society, researchers, people from the European Commission, from European Parliament, academics, to really brainstorm on what are the aspects that should really change in European policy, and what are the elements that should be incorporated in a food system policy, a real food policy. And that led to a forum meeting that brought together about 350 people to formulate concrete actions. The idea was not to have general recommendations that the European Commission should do this or that in vague terms, but be very specific and things that are implementable and that are realistic. And so in that we drafted a quite large number of policy recommendations and actions. And that was then worked into a final report that came out just before the European elections. And that was the idea, was to influence the new European Parliament and the new Commission. And that resulted in about 70 very concrete recommendations, like, for example, having a vice president of the European Commission in charge of food policy. That is above all the Directorate General, in order to have a coordinated and aligned policy across all the different sectors. And I think this has had a relative positive impact, in that the farm to fork policy strategy, the farm to fork strategy that was published a bit later by the European Commission, actually took a lot of inspiration from this IPES food report. And since we published that, there's a community of practice that has continued to work together to continue to influence, and that brings together quite a number of civil society organizations that are playing very important role in advocacy for moving closer towards a European food policy, and especially starting to implement some of the actions that were recommended. We have more recently also published a report on the whole question of protein. There's a lot of debate going on now that the current food system is not going, from a climate point of view, is not going to be sustainable, that we need to reduce emissions. There's a lot of claims about reducing meat, or particularly red meat, consumption and production. And the purpose of this report was really to analyze these different claims. Some of these claims are drawing attention to the problem, like, for example, producing too much of the red meat is producing too much greenhouse gases and is not sustainable. Or other claims are more geared towards a solution. For example, saying that alternatives to meat, like what I would call fake meat or veggie burgers, or some other claim about lab meat, that these are the sustainable solutions that have to be put in place. And so the purpose of this report was really to analyze who is making those claims, why are they making those claims, and what evidence is there behind these claims. And that, I think, is really debunking a lot of the kind of influence that the users of these claims try to have on the public. And I think that the general public really has to better understand what these claims are about, and particularly recognize that there's an enormous amount of concentration of power in the industrial agri-food system, and that actually the people that are the biggest sellers of meat and that control all the slaughterhouses, etc., are now also the same companies that are starting to produce the veggie burgers or engaging in producing lab meat. So it's further consolidating the power of these companies and the influence they have on the consumers. And a lot of push towards these veggie burgers, for example, is not really controlled very well. The impact on health of this type of food, which is ultra processed, is also not well understood. And so there are still a lot of questions. So I cannot go into detail here, but I invite you all to go through the report. I want to say also a few words about what is happening outside of Europe. We have been working in West Africa in particular. We have activities in different parts of the world, but we had a policy process trying to influence policies in favor of agroecology in West Africa. And there we've been working with farmer organizations and civil society organizations, and an alliance for agroecology for West Africa was established in 2018 that now counts 72 farmer and civil society and research organizations that are working together towards accelerating the food system transformation and implementing agroecology. This alliance has now been recognized by ECOWAS, which is the regional political body in West Africa, the Regional Commission for West Africa. The ECOWAS is actually supporting, this, in part at least, the secretariat of the alliance. And we are organizing a forum where all these actors will be coming together, also with investors and donors, in order to develop a strategy for the acceleration of an agroecological transformation in West Africa. That meeting will be held in December this year in Guinea-Bissau. And the purpose is really to lay the foundation of a regional strategy that should be adopted by ECOWAS as the regional strategy to transform and make food systems more sustainable in West Africa. So there we are working a lot with different kind of civil society and farmer organizations to really try to accelerate that transition. And that is particularly important today when we see the crisis. First, we have the COVID crisis and the impact that has had on showing the vulnerability of our globalized food systems that are relying a lot on long-term, long-distance transportation of commodities. And when there is a disruption in the transport system, the consequences it has had on the availability of food, etc. And maybe even more so now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impact it has had not only on grain availability, but also on the price of fertilizers and availability of synthetic fertilizers. We see that this model that is based on large amounts of synthetic inputs is not sustainable. There's been demonstration before even that from a productivity point of view, we are seeing declining yields because of the soil being totally destroyed by the heavy use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. And I think this crisis has to be a strong signal that we should not now try to produce more wheat and maize to avoid hunger, as some vested interests are trying to advocate for with policymakers, but it should really be a strong signal to accelerate the food system transformation and the agricultural transformation that is very urgently needed. I just want to conclude by saying something about a report that is going to be published in 2 weeks from now, in beginning of October. And this is about looking at different narratives that are being used and different terminologies like agroecology, regenerative agriculture, and nature-based solutions. And we are seeing really that some of these terms become more and more used, but not always with the same meaning. And so this report is really looking at who is using these terms, in which fora are these terms being most used, and with what purpose and with what meaning, actually, because there is a lot of greenwashing going on, and people are trying to keep some confusion about the terminology that they are using, putting, for example, agroecology, regenerative agriculture, and nature-based solutions as if they were just the same thing or different words for the same thing. Pointing out what are the strength of the validity behind some of these terms, and especially the need to look at all the dimensions of food system transformation: economic, environmental, nutrition, health, climate, social, and that agroecology is actually the only concept that addresses all these at the same time. Regenerative agriculture is focusing mainly on the climate and environment dimensions. Nature-based solutions is such a vague concept that it doesn't mean much at all. And so we have to be very careful when we use the different terms. And we felt it very useful to make a reference to the 13 principles of agroecology. I don't mind people using the term regenerative agriculture if they say by applying the 13 principles of agroecology. But if it's something less than that, we have to be careful. So I know that you have to go on, and I also have to go on, unfortunately. So it's been a pleasure to be with you here. If there is a question I'm willing to answer, I still have a few minutes, but after that I will have to leave. And thank you very much again for inviting me.
Thank you, Yen. That was very, very nice, Emil. Thank you so much for your presentation. I don't know if anybody has a quick question for Emil before we move to our next speaker. If not, be very happy to forward the questions to you, Emil, and then we can keep that dialogue going.
With pleasure. I put the website of IPES Food in the chat so people can find all the reports and information about IPES Food in the chat.
And someone's looking for the 13 principles as well. So will we find those on the website?
You can find them in the HLPE report. That's the high-level panel of experts. I'm sure that Judith can give you the reference to that.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Emil, for being with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye now. So our next speaker we will turn to is Judith Hitchman, who's a food sovereignty activist, a former consumer constituency representative in the civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism of the UN Committee on Food Security on behalf of Urgency International CSA Network. She's elected president of Urgency from 2015 to 2021. She advocates for short food chains policy, linking food sovereignty and solidarity economy. She's a board member and a joint coordinator of RIPES, the Intercontinental Network for the Promotion of Social Solidarity Economy, and represents RIPES as observer in the UN Interagency Task Force for Social and Solidarity Economy. Gosh, they have such long titles. Judith, you're very, very welcome to our European Assembly. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's always an honor and a challenge to speak after someone like Emil. I'd like to just say that Urgency participated extensively in the food policy labs that he mentioned, and we have been very actively involved in the farm to fork policy building and advocacy negotiations. We're living in a period of extensive crisis at the moment between the war in Ukraine, the food crisis, which is caused by climate change through drought and floods, and also the food price crisis that is partly generated by the causes that Emil mentioned, the war in Ukraine. And we're rapidly approaching a period where people are going to have to decide this winter, are they going to eat or are they going to heat? Because people are increasingly impoverished. Next slide, please. So just to give you the definition of food sovereignty, it's the right of peoples to a healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. Now, this is part of the Nyéléni Declaration from 2007, where all the food sovereignty social movements came together in Nyéléni in Mali. But this, of course, is in stark contrast with the actual system, which is where food systems have been linked to the governance of the global food and agriculture, with long food chains that Emile mentioned, which have broken down with COVID, and the commodification of land, seeds, inputs, and water, all of which are at a critical level for many different reasons that I've mentioned, as well as the commercialization of overly processed foods. And all of this, of course, is very far removed from food sovereignty. Next slide, please. So the situation today is hyper concentration with 20 global corporations controlling most of the food chain. The three biggest control over 50% of the seeds, whereas what we need are peasant seeds that are adapted to local conditions and the right to freely save and exchange those seeds. 4 corporations control over 99% of the livestock breeding. 10 corporations control 55% of the fertilizers. 4 traders control 75% of the grain and soybean market, and 11 corporations control 30% of the food processing industry. And this is really hyper concentration and really works against feeding people locally through sustainable food systems. Next slide, please. The SOFI report this year, which is the state of food insecurity in the world, that is published by the FAO every year in July during the high-level political forum, shows that 1 in 10 people in the world is malnourished. Hunger is rising, particularly, as was mentioned at the beginning by Sarah, and it is pretty obvious that SDG 2 will not be achieved by 2030. We also have a problem of obesity, which is increasing, 30% of the global population. And with the current food price crisis and the food crisis, the access to healthy food and vegetables is becoming increasingly difficult because people are buying more cheap food that is not nutritious, and many people in countries like France today cannot afford 3 proper meals a day with appropriate quantities of fresh fruit and vegetables. We have approximately 50% of the population, including totally new categories, but specifically students and elderly, who are frequenting food banks and who need food support through stamps and various other local government and national measures. Next slide, please. And practicing food sovereignty in a period of climate crisis really emphasizes the need for us to build resilience. And Urgency published a report quite recently, which is on resilience in times of COVID. And I've just put that link into the chat. Next slide, please. So COVID created what can be viewed as a vicious circle, because people lost jobs, they lost their sources of income, therefore they couldn't pay their rent, they lost their homes in many cases. In Ireland, there are over 3,000 families who are now homeless. They were unable to buy and continue to be unable to buy healthy, nutritious food, which of course in turn has led to ill health, which favors COVID. And I would like to say that the COVID crisis is far from over. People are talking as though it were over. It is not. Next slide, please. Now, there are many possible policy solutions. First of all, we can have a minimum income guarantee. We can have social security safety nets to protect people and to protect them in all sorts of ways in terms of housing, health, and access to food. Social and solidarity economy includes solutions like cooperative housing and community land trusts. We also need to look at something else in Europe, which would be a food safety net with food as part of the commons. And this needs to be worked into the Sustainable Food Systems Law. And we need to have stronger public health systems. Next slide, please. Sustainable food systems are based essentially, I believe, on short food chains. This is quite clear in the farm to fork policy, because 70% of our food globally is produced by small-scale farmers and can be sourced locally. And the issue today is really localizing the SDGs. And here we're talking specifically about SDG 2. This can be done through local farmers markets, allotments, community gardens, growing it yourself, community-supported agriculture. And I'd just like to say that urgency represents approximately 3 million people worldwide, of whom 1 million approximately are in Europe. Local food co-ops, local collective producers shops, solidarity shops and systems, and farm gate sales. Next slide, please. We have done a lot of work within the Committee on World Food Security and the FAO, and there is a very good policy document which is called Connecting Smallholders to Markets, which you can find on the FAO website. Next slide, please. There's also work that has been done and continues to be done on the voluntary guidelines on nutrition and sustainable food systems in the Committee on World Food Security. And of course, we will and are already engaging in Europe, both in the Green Deal as REPES, the Intercontinental Network for the Promotion of Social and Solidarity Economy, and in the Farm to Fork and the Sustainable Food Systems Law, which we will be very actively involved in. Thank you. Next slide. Just a word on SDG 12 and food loss and waste. A study by the late Nigel Baker from Coventry University very clearly showed how community-supported agriculture reduces waste overall to 6.71%, whereas the industrial food chain and supermarkets, the figure is approximately 55.2%. So the direct production on the farm and direct sales to consumers through community-supported agriculture also contributes very strongly both to biodiversity and to food loss and waste reduction, as well as supporting solidarity shares for vulnerable groups within the community. Next slide, please. So community-supported agriculture has two key pillars, the first being food sovereignty and the second being social solidarity economy. Thank you. Next slide. And the FAO has the 10 elements of agroecology. I haven't had time to put the link into the chat, but I will do so immediately after this. And one of the 10 elements of agroecology is solidarity economy. So it shows that we actually do need an economic system change in order to realize food sovereignty and agroecology, which is something that Emil mentioned. Next slide, please. So within the United Nations, there are many different entry points where we have been working. First of all, on realizing the right to food and nutrition, protecting peasants and pastoralists' rights through the access to land, water, seeds, and biodiversity, particularly through UNDROP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants. the protection of small-scale fishers' rights through the small-scale fisheries voluntary guidelines, the protection of indigenous peoples' rights through UNDRIP, which is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, workers' rights, which are covered by the ILO, consumers' rights, and RIPES has been particularly involved in the SDGs and their localization. And we hope to see a resolution in the United Nations General Assembly in this upcoming session to recognize and support the social and solidarity economy, which already is an accepted element within the ILO, because the last ILO conference in June was held on social and solidarity economy and decent work. Next slide, please. One of the challenges is that all of these diverse elements that I have mentioned are covered by different United Nations agencies and treaties. And even though the UN now has a policy of deliver as one, it is extremely challenging for our social movements to intervene in a holistic way right across all of these different treaties and agencies. Next slide, please. So the key concerns, both within urgency and RIPES, are, as far as food sovereignty is concerned, social and food justice, agroecology, which Emil talked about, connecting farmers to markets and localizing the SDGs, advocacy for policy frameworks and legislation, including at European Union level. And I would just like to urge members of the Commission not to roll back any of the farm to fork and plough up set-aside land that has been set aside for biodiversity to grow more grain to feed animals. We need more food for humans. System change and not climate change is what we need. We need to strengthen our urban-rural linkages, access to and preservation of agricultural land, water and seeds, and specifically a human rights-based system. Next slide, please. Oh, this hasn't come out at all as it should have in terms of a slide. Maybe I should share my screen and possibly it will. I'm going to try and see if I can do this. I'm not sure if I can. Because it was sorry, no, it's not going to work. I was trying to show you a diagram of how urgency implements its different policies through the United Nations and through the European Union work. How can I stop sharing the screen? Can somebody help me to stop sharing the screen?
I don't think you are sharing your screen, or it's not coming up for me anyway.
Okay, right.
So I think if you're fine, if you just maybe could explain the diagram and
it really just showed how we interface with all the different agencies at European level through the Food Policy Coalition and IPES Food, and through the United Nations Interagency Task Force on Social and Solidarity Economy, as well as working together with other social movements in the International Planning Committee on Food Sovereignty, through the civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism, and other elements such as the high-level political forum, whereas RIPES we have for the last 2 years in a row held successful official side events. So I would just like to show the final slide, please. Can you do that? To say thank you very much to everybody for your time. And I hope that this is of some help in our discussions.
Thank you very much indeed, Judith. That was really interesting how you've made all the connections with the different organizations. And indeed, again, another example of the great work that's being done at various levels on the ground, at the grassroots level, but also we're seeing what's happening at the policy level too. There is now a presentation, speaking of policy and frameworks. We're going to hear next from Eamon Drum from the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And he's going to talk about SDN's 6 transformations framework for a sustainable food system within the EU context. He's the senior program officer leading the new SDGs Transformation Center of the SDSN, and working closely with the UN, governments, financial institutions, and civil society organizations. This new center will build on robust, recognized instruments developed by the SDSN, such as the SDG Index and dashboards, to promote ambitious SDG policies at the global, national, and subnational levels. So Eamon, you're very welcome. Last but not least, it's great to have you here. You have the floor. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah. I hope that you can hear me. Yes, I'm not going to introduce myself further, but I appreciate the introduction. SDSN, you may know, we are a research and advocacy organization for the SDGs, and we publish the flagship Sustainable Development Report alongside regional versions, including one for Europe, which will, our next European edition will be coming out at the end of this month. We also do research into policy trackers and spillover effects of country level outcomes and policies on the SDGs globally. The issue that we're confronted with now, and as you're well aware, is the complexity for governments of monitoring 17 goals, 169 targets, 200 plus indicators. It is useful for us as a statistical organization to have that information, but in terms of actionability, it makes things complicated for governments. And the 6 transformations framework is something that we proposed to simplify and to channel efforts and budgets towards achieving the SDGs in a more comprehensive way. Next slide, please. We are currently working, as I said, on this on our next year's reports, or rather for our next edition of the European SDG report. The main conclusions of which are becoming, in fact, you can go to the next slide already, please. The main conclusions of which are becoming clear is that progress in the SDGs in Europe, as in most of the rest of the world, have stalled. The answers to how we address this issue come during a big year for the EU with the EU-wide PNR. Our report is structured around contributions from expert scientists, and we want to offer big ideas that can be picked up by the Commission, including the 6 transformations framework. Next slide, please. Without dwelling too much on the topic, I just wanted to show that from our research, the extent to which we've quantified the range of levels of SDG attainment across Europe, but also the various levels of progress and direction of travel for other countries at the regional level. This suggests the need for both a European-wide institutional approach, of course, but one that can also be localized given country-level differences and specificities. Next slide, please. This is probably more information than can be digested in one quick viewing, but evidence to this point that I just mentioned about from our most recent European SDG report. Again, we're looking at the status of countries' progress on individual SDGs, but also the direction of travel, meaning how are they intending and expressing how they're moving forward through policy commitments, government efforts, and others. Next slide, please. One of our innovations was to, in the past years, has been to include the spillover index, which scores countries based on their environmental and social impacts embodied into trade, finance, and security. These have heavy bearing, of course, on food systems, which are deeply linked to all of those 3 issues. Next slide, please. In our spillover rankings and index, the higher score means that a country causes more positive and fewer negative spillover effects. Food systems are deeply embedded in this dynamic. And I invite you to learn more about this in the report. You can simply search for SDG index online. However, you'll find that, as I think I've highlighted, that the European Union and more largely rich countries, OECD member states, have the largest and most significant spillover effects in food systems, are deeply concerned by this. Next slide, please. The last European SDR report indicated 4 priority actions that we were going to take to accelerate progress on, or rather reattaining progress on the SDGs in the EU and internationally. How are we going to implement this 6 transformations framework, which I'll explain slightly at the end. I just wanted to set up the context in a way that would make sense. It's a bit too late to address the multi-stakeholder platform, but we're looking now basically to influence the VNR instead. That's also part of the timing for our releasing the European SDR report in September. This gives the Commission time to pick up ideas. We're intending to issue some joint communications on these issues with fellow organizations. The time is right. At the UN high-level political forum this year, there was a notable emphasis on SDGs 4, 5, 15, 17, and we're adapting our presentation of the 6 transformations to this, to really embrace language about a systemic approach to sustainable food systems. The main question that we're confronting, and now I'll move on to the 6 T's proper, is that how can we rethink the SDGs in a way that reformulates them and avoids cherry picking and rather emphasizes systemic action, concentrating efforts, focusing on synergies and trade-offs. And next slide, please. Essentially, the 6 transformations framework is emerged out of a paper published by our director, Jeffrey Sachs, and other colleagues in 2019. It involves looking at government efforts, process indicators, and other indicators of SDG status and progress, and wraps them into 6 categories, which you see here. The 4th key category, the fourth key transformation, is about sustainable food, land, water, and oceans. Where we stand now, the key issue is getting this idea into member states, where there's a risk of confusing work being done on the SDGs with the Green Deal. We need to be clear about what the 6 transformations brings to the table, and to not muddy the water. But we think that this framework, which is detailed and will be detailed more, and also in the forthcoming European SDR report, we think that these can help people to organize their thoughts around the SDGs, especially ahead of the VNR. And we're aligning our issues also with work being done, for example, by the OECD on policy coherence for sustainable development. Next slide, please. So this work, the methodology of which you can find on our website, I'm not going to get into too much technical detail here, but this involves charting pathways, spreadsheet models that identify the ways countries can achieve certain objectives, particularly around food and land use, by working backwards from a goal, essentially. And the value added of this is not just the output of the model, but the fact that scientists and other stakeholders are working in collaboration and in a transparent way, while also embracing the full scope of an integrated framework for diets, food production, and biodiversity production. Next slide, please. This just charts this is sort of the basis of the model, but I'm not going to go into that. I can go to the next slide. We're doing modeling work based on the 6 transformations that involves, I guess, as I mentioned, tracking government policy and supply chains, also about how subnational governments like cities can work on improving their impact on the SDGs. This allows us to go into much more granular detail about specific policy actions to be taken. We're tracking these metrics for the G7, G20 countries, but also looking at Europe as a whole region. For example, doing due diligence on supply chains, and some of that work. Eurostat, for example, is starting to integrate information on consumption-based targets, which is something that we've worked extensively on in the context of the 6 Ts, but specifically on food systems. And the question now is, how is this going to be, or whether this is going to be included in the upcoming VNR? We certainly hope so, and that's where we're concentrating our efforts with the forthcoming publication. And I'll go to the final slide now, please. just to once again drive home that we encourage you to read our report that's coming out. I've mentioned some of the stakeholders with whom we're collaborating, but we have a lot of activities planned at the EU and member state levels around this report, around the 6 transformations, and the framework behind it. So we would, of course, be welcome to solicit your questions, remarks. I'm in charge of the new SDG Transformation Center, which Sarah mentioned at the beginning, but essentially it's going to be a new hub for data and research involving and based around the 6 transformations that will encompass our existing flagship reports, the Sustainable Development Report, but also new work tracking more timely data on, for example, geospatial and policy data, for example, to get a better and more current sense of the state of play on these key issues. So with that, I will end. Thank you very much. And of course, I'm happy to take any questions afterwards.
Great, Eamon, thank you. That was, you win the prize for the record presentation. Well done. I'd love to hear a lot more about the 6 transformations, because they seem to be such a really neat way of bringing together the SDGs, and it might really help policymakers as well. So if we have policy coherence for sustainable development and the 6 transformations framework, I think it could be very, very interesting. Now, we've come to the end of our presentations, and I really want to thank everyone for an amazing, very informative and really interesting range of presentations. And also thank you to all of you who've been participating in this event today. But I would like to ask, we do have time for some questions. So does anybody who's been listening from the floor, would anybody like to ask any questions of our speakers and panelists? And if you do, would you mind, raising your hand? And we don't have much time, so but I'm very, very happy to take some questions. Everybody's been very patient with us. So would anybody like to ask anything? I don't see any hands raised at the moment.
I think there were also some questions in the chat, Sarah, maybe if you want to have a look there.
Okay, I think there was something from Valerie about the 13 principles, but I think that, if anybody can see the questions there.
I put the link to the 10 principles of agroecology into the chat, so it is there.
We also have a question from Joy, who says they'd like to know your thinking about renewable energy and family farming. I don't know if Joy wants to expand on that, maybe.
And who was it addressed to, Joy? The question?
Yes, thank you. My question is that we are working in Bangladesh and rural areas, and we are facing the power cuts. So how we can engage the rural communities with the renewable energy, like solar support for their agriculture, their pump system or other things. So how we are thinking in the rural area, we can introduce these things that will be helpful for production, especially the local production, for facing the food security of the local level or by themselves.
Thank you for that question, Joy. Judith, you have your hand up. Would you like to answer that question?
No, I wanted to ask a question, Sarah.
Okay. Would anybody, the floor is open, so would anybody like to answer that question about renewable energy and food systems?
I was...
It doesn't seem that we have any takers on that question, I'm afraid to say, Joy. I think really what there is to say about it is the fact that it can't be separated. Renewable energy can't be separated from food systems. It's very important to know that everything is integral. Everything is is interlinked. And we can't just focus on renewable energy and not focus on food, because part of our holistic, or should we say a systemic approach, means that we really need to be looking at both. So I don't know if that in any way answers your question on that. But I think, and I know that there will be people who do look at that, and maybe I suggest that online you look at you know, some of the reports on food systems and renewable energy and how they interlink. So I don't have anything to hand right now, but I hope that at least answers a little bit of your question. Anyone else like to ask a question? Oh, Judith, you have your hand up. Yes.
I just wanted to add one piece of information. In May, Social Economy Europe organized a big European meeting on the Green Deal, and there was a report on renewable energy and food that Aurore Medieu and I worked on. So that is part of the answer to that question. But my question really was to Eamon. Eamon, the figures of whether the goals are achieved or not, that diagram, you have affordable electricity as a goal achieved. Now that of course has gone completely out of the window, I believe, with the war in Ukraine. When was that report compiled, and how are you updating it? Because people are just not going to be able to pay their energy bills in the coming winter.
Sorry, was that in, I think I'm trying to from my notes, was that on the France diagram, or if it was at a country level?
It was a country level on, no, it wasn't. It was on the different goals and whether or not they had been achieved. With a color coding system. I know it was only on for a very brief period, but I sort of saw the...
Yes. Well, the methodology is a bit, SDG being achieved is, it doesn't mean that it's been 100% satisfied. It means that there's the direction of travel and the goals that have been set at the country level have been satisfied in that year. But it's true that with the current energy crisis, obviously countries can backtrack, and that's what we're seeing. In fact, is that the COVID crisis and the war in Ukraine have had significant impacts. These are not static, and once an objective is attained, it's not a given that it will remain so. This is definitely one of the issues that we're confronted with, as I mentioned, is the stalled pace of change on achieving the SDGs, and impacts some backsliding in certain countries. So that will be reflected in this coming upcoming report coming out this September.
Thanks, Todd. It is moving very fast.
Great. Do we have any other questions here? I know that Candida, you had a question about, which might be answered by Murad actually, to do with the pull tank that you showed in your picture. Could it be used to provide water to other regeneration plots in the area, especially during the hotter months? Candida, would you like to step in there if you're still online? I don't think she is. Okay. Well, I have a closing treat for us all. We're going to actually show a video, which we didn't show earlier on, from MEP Grace O'Sullivan, who's looking at the linking the environment and agriculture for a sustainable food system. And Grace is a member of the PESH Maritime Affairs and Fisheries Committee, and ENVI, the Committee on Environment, Public Health and Food Safety. She's a member of delegations on Mercosur and Palestine, and a number of working groups, including co-chair of the Greens EFA Biodiversity Working Group. She's formerly an Irish senator and a member of the MEP's SDGs Alliance. And she is an ex-champion surfer and spent 20 years working with Greenpeace, 10 of those years at sea as a crew member of the Rainbow Warrior. So we'd like to hear from Grace, and this is our closing to everyone. So thank you so much for your time in being here. Thank you for your wonderful presentations, and do click on the other links and join some of the other Global People's Assembly sessions. I guarantee you will not be bored. So thank you very much, everyone. I'll leave you with Grace O'Sullivan now to have the final word.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Grace O'Sullivan, and I'm MEP for Ireland South. It's a pleasure to speak to you from Ireland today, where I'm just about to head off to the National Ploughing Championships, which is Europe's largest agricultural showcase in the in my capacity as a Green MEP, where I'll be highlighting the importance of sustainability, biodiversity, and the crucial role farmers have to play in mitigating climate change. Climate justice must be at the heart of all political decision-making as we transition to more sustainable ways of living. This means reducing carbon emissions, but also helping small farmers compete with their industrial counterparts and making sure our agricultural policy does not come at the expense of developing countries' own sectors. It is a priority for me that SDGs should be at the heart of all EU policy. Unfortunately, as you know, this isn't always the case. Yet Europe faces its greatest SDG challenges in the areas of the environment, sustainable food and agriculture, climate and biodiversity, and gender equality. The link between the European Green Deal and the SDGs highlighted in the 8th Environment Action Programme, which I negotiated on behalf of the European Parliament, forms the basis for achieving the environment and climate-related objectives defined in the UN 2030 Agenda. As the negotiator, I sought to ensure that the SDGs are more than just key words in policy papers, but are translated into real action. This included areas of legislation to protect soil quality, a deadline to end fossil fuel subsidies, and a commitment to measure success differently from just growth and GDP. How we legislate also needs improving. Currently, these areas are handled independently of one another in capitals and institutions, by separate offices in the Commission and parliamentary committees. Strategy for effective food system governance and a whole of EU approach across all sectors can help maximize synergies between the different policy areas. Now, as a lifelong activist with Greenpeace, having spent many years on the high seas, the health of the marine and coastal ecosystems is a specific priority for me. So SDG 14 in the EU context, including marine conservation and sustainable fisheries, is central to my work here in the European Parliament. Oceans are the world's largest active carbon sink and marine ecosystem, and they have a particular high potential to capture and store carbon. So as well as you know, being homes to millions of species of different wildlife. So the oceans and the seas are our greatest ally. The EU has a wide range of policies for our oceans, but progress is slow. It is also impossible to ignore the negative impact our own policies have on developing countries. Safeguarding key biodiversity areas through the establishment of marine protected areas is an essential contribution towards SDGs 14 and 15. That is what my colleagues and I are working towards with our work on the restoration law and the biodiversity strategy. The designation of new networks of marine protected areas, MPAs, will help the EU achieve its marine biodiversity commitments and ensure that 30% of EU marine space is protected by 2030. Will be vital that a third of these MPAs are strictly protected from all human interference. And this must be done together with local communities involved at every step. So here's my message to you today. Make sure that the work you are undertaking today on sustainable food systems translates to action on the ground in communities and institutions all around the world. We've had plenty of high-level speeches, events and announcements already. Commitments have been made and many have unfortunately already been missed. So in my line of work, we get the best results for climate and biodiversity when we team up with communities with hands-on experience and knowledge. Hand in hand with the challenges we face in the fight to tackle climate change, we must ensure that the health and well-being of all society in general, whether that is moving beyond GDP to a sustainable well-being economy or placing human rights and equality of life at the center of our decision-making. So aligned with the overarching priorities outlined, as I said, the protection and support of the natural world, the air, sea and land are at the heart of my work in the European Parliament, which is focused on key objectives of protection, restoration and accountability. So I'd like to leave you today with a quote from the Kenyan social, environment and political activist and the first African woman Nobel Peace winner, Wangari Maathai. the environment and the economy are really both sides of the same coin. If we cannot sustain the environment, we cannot sustain ourselves. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you very much, Grace. On that fitting note, this is now the end of the European Assembly. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you in an hour for the African Assembly.
Thank you.